So as part of my function at AWS, one of the things that my team does is work closely with startups to advise them on all manner of things. I spend very little time actually talking about AWS. Most of our team is made up of former founders, few venture capitalists. My area of expertise happens to be business development. I think I've got a slide in here. So a little bit about my background. I started to put together one of those slides with a bunch of company logos on it, and it started to look a little bit cheesy. And I realized I had a stack of business cards from everywhere that I have ever been. I started my career at Apple back when they had the multicolored logo, so that tells you how old I am. I started there when John Sculley was CEO and left about 3 months before Steve Jobs came back. So I was kind of at Apple during the dark days. Left to do my first startup in 1996, which was NetObjects, which is a company that built software for web publishing. Company got acquired by IBM, and we'll talk a little bit about the nature of that deal. Went to another company called WebCentric, the only one of the companies that we ran out of business, and had a big impact on why I'm at AWS today. It was a company that made web conferencing software. So if you think of like a WebEx, but it was all done in native HTML and JavaScript. So there were no plugins, there were no crazy things that you had to do in order to get it to work. Left there and went to AuctionWatch, aggregation of e-commerce content that was acquired by Alibaba. Small time at Valicert, security company that did certificate resolution. Got acquired by Tumbleweed, which was a public company, ran business development there for 3 years, email security. Another small startup, Senzik, that was acquired by Trustwave. Then on to an Israeli-based firm called Finjan that was in the security space as well. That was acquired by M86. And then completely divergent path into Smule. Is anybody familiar with Smule? So the CEO at Tumbleweed made enough money and quit and then spun up this little music startup called Smule. So he tapped me to come in and help basically negotiate a truce with the music industry. And then CloudOn was the last startup I did. So Smule's still alive. There's rumors that they might IPO next year, so they've grown quite well. Last startup I did was with a company called CloudOn. We basically did virtualization of applications to mobile devices. So if you wanted Microsoft Office on your iPad way before Microsoft provided it, we could deliver it to you. And then sold that to Dropbox about 3.5 years ago and joined Amazon. And the story there is WebCentric ran out of money because we spent $8 million of the first $30 million we raised on Sun hardware. This was back when you had to rack and stack servers in order to get anything done. CloudOn, we scaled from 0 to 5 million users in about a year and spent no money on hardware. And for me, that was kind of how things have changed. And Charles talked a little bit about this morning, about how much easier it is to get up and running as a startup now, which has its benefits and it has some side. But what I want to talk to you about today is kind of when in the life cycle of a startup does it make sense for you to start thinking about partnerships and relationships with third parties, how you can grow your business through those types of relationships. And then when I'm done, Ryan Kiskus is going to come up and talk to you about some of the programs that Amazon offers to help drive business into startups. So mine's sort of here's philosophically how you should be thinking about this, and then Ryan's going to come in with some actual meat and content to help you understand how we can help you drive your business. This session I typically do is very much an interactive one, so if you have questions, raise your hand. At some point in time, I'm going to stop talking and ask you guys if there are particular situations that you're in that you're looking for advice on. Actually, some of the best advice comes from other people in the audience, so I want this to be an interactive session, otherwise we're going to end way early. Make sense? Okay. So I get a lot of questions from startups that I advise about when should I be looking externally, or AT&T's reached out to us and they've got this amazing opportunity for us. What do you think? And I start with the basic premise of there are reasons to partner, and there are things that partners can do for you, and there are reasons to stay far, far away from them until you've reached a certain point in your business. And so I always advise startups The longer you can wait before you get external distractions from people that may come knocking on your doors with these great looking opportunities, the better. So partners can bring you visibility and validity, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific deals that I've done in that area. Distribution, technology, access to markets, and revenue. And revenue is the most important. And I think that's sometimes what people forget. What partnerships aren't going to do for you? They're not going to solve company leadership problems. They're not going to give you product definition. In fact, that's the furthest thing you should want from a partnership. They're not going to help you with product market fit. They're not going to help you with your business model, or they're not going to help you fix a flawed product. So my point in this particular slide is, until you have everything on the right-hand side nailed, I wouldn't entertain any kind of conversation with a larger company or another company around a partnership, because it'll just become a distraction for you and for your teams. And I've seen it devastate companies, especially startups that don't have all the things on the right-hand side nailed. Does that make sense? So make sure you have your core business nailed down before you start entertaining and talking to third parties about distribution deals or licensing deals. The one exception I'll make to that is on the technology side, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let's dig a little bit deeper on value. So one of the things that you need as a startup, or you're striving for, visibility and viability. And one of the things that a partner can bring to you is both of those things. They can help to validate your business by entering into a relationship with you. And when I say a relationship, I'm not talking about doing a press release. I'm talking about an actual business driving relationship. So in this case, when I was at NetObjects, we're a small little firm, about 35 people. We managed to work out a licensing deal that I did with Netscape. Netscape at the time was sort of the bee's knees and got all kinds of press for it. And it was a particular relationship where we were bundling our product as part of their suite, and they were paying us for it, right? So there were revenue commitments up front from them that allowed us to delay raising money. There were certainly PR and story benefits for us. It took about 5 or 6 months to get done, but the most important thing is they weren't requiring us to make any changes to our product. They were going to take it exactly as it was. And that meant I didn't have any conflicts with the product team. I wasn't derailing the product process. We were going to continue on exactly the way we were going to go, but I was getting revenue and visibility in return. That, interestingly enough, led to conversations with IBM. And we were able to replicate that deal with IBM in a way that guaranteed us $10 million worth of revenue. And we became the default editing tool for IBM's web platform. So those are the kinds of deals that are interesting and are worth spending time on. I stay away from anything that looks like it's just a press release and hand waving, because people see right through that right away. Both of those deals actually brought me distribution as well. So looking to get your product out in the marketplace, especially at the time, because going into consumer software is extremely expensive. Building a channel and those types of things are extremely expensive, and I was able to ride on Lotus and Netscape's coattails into the consumer channel without spending I actually made money. So technology, that was the one where I said I'd make an exception. So when I first started raising money, one of the questions that the venture community would always ask you is, okay, show me what IP you own and what IP you don't own. And the notion was the more IP you owned, the more valuable you were for a company, and it became a big friction if you were licensing things. And things have come a complete 180. Venture capitalists are no longer concerned so much about how much IP you own. They're concerned about the market share you're able to capture. So if you look at a company like Uber, for instance, Uber was able to get to market very quickly because they licensed Google Maps. They used Twilio for their communication streams, and they used Braintree on the back end to process all their payments. 20 years ago, a VC would say, no, you need to build all of that yourself. The common thinking has changed. So the one area where I would encourage you to get involved early in relationships is if you can license in technology that speeds your time to market, by 6 months or more, and you can strike a deal that's reasonable and doesn't commit you to too much and allows you to plug and unplug technologies you need, you should absolutely do it. But on the product side, you should make sure that you build that integration in a way that you can unplug it or plug in something else or build your own later if you need to. But technology licensing can get you to market faster, and there's a lot of, Amazon's famous for saying we do all this undifferentiated heavy lifting, right? Nobody's gonna add value to your company because you've spun up servers and things. I view technology the same way. If you can license something instead of build it, and that company's solid, and they're gonna spend all of their time working on improving that piece of technology, absolutely do it. Any questions thus far? All right. So access to markets. The other place that you can get lots of help is accessing especially international markets. So if you get to a point where you're thinking about, you've got your business built here in the US, and you're thinking about going overseas, in some markets you have to do it with a partner. I'm working on a couple of deals right now in China. I've done some JVs in Japan, but you absolutely have to be in market with a partner who can help you with tons of things like localization and distribution and market knowledge and things like that. And then the last thing is revenue. I would not do a deal as a startup unless there was revenue attached to it. Because to me, and we'll talk about this a little bit further, at the point in time that you've gotten a commitment from a large company is when they write you a check. They can promise you all kinds of things, but you know they're committed when they write you a check. So I always look for revenue commitments up front, and if I can get it, a check up front. Because that tells me that this has gone through the entire decision process within the company to the point where they're willing to hand me money. And if they're not willing to hand me money, they're probably not going to help me.
How about, so that's more like if it's got concrete, like we'll pay you 10 million, like per month or whatever. How about, is that change if it's like value-based or it's the same thing? Where like we'll give you a percentage of, our revenue we gain by using our product?
Yeah, you can back into a number by looking at it, and this is the way I structured it with IBM. Is it was a $10 million commitment. If we got to the end of the year and they'd only earned out 8, they'd just cut me a check for 2. But if it's a percentage-based value, like you asked, so the question was, what if it's, there isn't a hard number there, you're doing kind of a rev share type arrangement. So what I would do in that situation is take your worst case forecast and commit to it. So if your worst case forecast is $10 million in revenue for the year and you're doing a 50-50 rev share, you should commit $5 million to me. And that's when you also find out when people start to hedge those numbers, well, it's our worst case forecast, but we really, it may be only 3. That's good to know, right? That's good for you to know so that you can understand how much work it's going to be for you to move forward in that kind of deal. But I strongly encourage you, and it's hard sometimes to walk away from deals if people won't commit to revenue, but to me that's a clear bar that needs to be hit in order for me to invest time and energy, especially if I'm making any changes to a product. If I'm doing anything at all that requires resources, there's got to be revenue. And there was this notion in the past, and I'm dating myself again, anytime you got into a project with a company, as a startup you would ask for NRE. And it was basically money to fund the product work that you were doing. It's called non-recurring engineering expenses. Those are okay, but you can't count those as revenue. And if you guys are in the early stages of monetizing, you realize $1 of revenue is worth a lot more to you than $1 of cost savings, right? Because people want to look at your revenue run rate. They don't want to look at, how much money were you able to save. So the startup world's moved away from this NRE model to a more revenue-based model. Questions? Anybody involved in a partnership discussion right now that maybe you'd want to talk about and share with the team? So the question was, how do you structure these marketing relationships where there are rev shares and things? And then what do you do if somebody doesn't want to commit? Really, if you're going to call it a true partnership, you need to make commitments to each other. If somebody's not willing to make a commitment, that's not really a partnership I'm interested in pursuing. And I've done a lot of those types of relationships. The ones that are successful are the ones where both companies are willing to commit to tangible results and are willing to commit to backing that up. So if they don't hit their numbers, they write a check. The ones that I've seen that have gone a lot of talk and gone nowhere, even though a lot of resources have been dumped into them, is where people aren't willing to make commitments. So you got to think about this as a CEO or as a founder, is that you've got very limited resources and very limited time. And there are probably 20 things that you could do to make money, right? But you have resources to do two. So whether you succeed or not depends on whether you pick the top 2 opportunities and double down on those, or whether you run around and try and do idea 18 and 19, in which case you're going to run out of money and be out of business. Yiming.
Would you share the advice on when do you ask for the check? So the customer or the potential customer may react positively to the concept of a product. At what stage of the product that you ask for the check from the customer? Whether it's at the beginning, the NRE stage, or is it has to be developed, they can beta test it and then ask for the check?
So it's part of the very first conversation I have with anyone. And it's to say, look, we're interested in this relationship, but here's how we work, right? We want a committed relationship where there's revenue available to us commensurate to the level of effort that we have to put into it. And lay out a couple of tenets, which I'll get into in future slides. And if that's not of interest to them, that's the only conversation we ever have to have, right? So I think the other thing that's really important is for you to be very clear about what your goals and objectives are, and for you to understand deeply what the goals and objectives of your potential partner are. Because if those two aren't in alignment, you're going to run into problems. And for me, it's best to figure that out in very early conversations, right? I think as a startup, sometimes you're a little bit concerned about, well, it's big company X, and they could make or break me. And I got to tell you, you need to be very clear about what your objectives are. And if they're not in alignment with what they're willing to do, walk away. You're wasting your time.
What are like the telltale signs for when partnership discussion are stalling and they're not going forward?
I think, some of what I have seen, there's obviously like a lack of communication, so somebody goes radio silent. The other is if you can't make progress around a particular plan or set of goals, where companies keep iterating and they come back to you with a different set of requirements about every other meeting that you have. And at that point in time, it becomes clear they don't really know what they want. There's a game that we used to call Find Me a Rock, where I had a boss that I worked for who would come to you with a set of requirements, and you'd come back with what he asked for, and he'd say, well, yeah, that's not really it. And so he'd give you another set of requirements, and you'd go, and you'd come back, and he's like, oh, we're getting closer now. It was sort of like, go get me a rock, and whatever rock I brought back wasn't the right one. If you find yourself in that kind of conversation with a partner where their requirements keep changing, I would put pause and say, you guys sit down, figure out exactly what you want, come back to me when you know what you want, and then we can have some other discussions, right? So we'll talk a little bit about sort of some traps to avoid. My biggest advice to startups when they come to me and say, hey, we want to hire a biz dev guy is don't do it. It's really important that you begin this type of business at the right time. Like I said, when you've got all of your other fundamentals nailed down. Typically, what I will join a company somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 months before they launch their product. That means the product's pretty much locked and loaded. They've got their first iteration out there. They're probably already beta testing. And what I come in to do is to help them develop and fine-tune their business model, go find their first, in an enterprise company, 5 customers, in a consumer company, first 1 million customers kind of thing. So you want to be bringing in a business development person when you're that far along. If you bring them in too early into the deal, it just creates friction. At WebCentric, I joined way too early. I spent 6 months trying to build business with a product that wasn't ready to go, and eventually moved to Germany to run the product team simply because I couldn't get anything done. Created a ton of friction between myself and what was eventually our VP of engineering, because I was trying to move along an agenda that was out of sync with where our product was. So wait as long as you possibly can. If you can launch and be successful without having any partnership relationships, more power to you, because then you have the most control over your business. So this is one that I've seen repeatedly that is an issue, and that is bringing in partners early also can derail your product roadmap. So one of the deals I was trying to push through with WebCentric was a very attractive deal with Deutsche Telekom. So, and because it was a German-based company, Deutsche Telekom was like the holy grail for customers, and immediately got all kinds of change requests for the product. Needed to be integrated with back-end systems, it needed to be copacetic with their billing system, needed to do some more localization for some markets they were in, and all of a sudden I had, a potentially company-making deal at odds and in conflict with the product roadmap that our VP of engineering was trying to run, right? And I've seen this take down companies, where all of a sudden outside influences are changing your product roadmap, changing your product schedule. This is, again, another one. Until you have everything nailed down, I would not risk this, because it can be a company killer. Mistaking bodies for commitments. Big companies often have a lot of people, and they're willing to assign a lot of people to a project that's maybe even just speculative. So I worked on about 8 months on a deal with AT&T where they had 14 people assigned to this project. And for me, that meant, wow, these guys are excited, they're really committed. What I eventually found out is these 14 people were people that really didn't have a home in AT&T, and they sort of stuck them on my project to get them out of the way and give them something to do. So not only did I not have commitment, I sort of had the D team assigned to me because they didn't know quite what to do with these people. So my lesson there was I had convinced myself this must be an important deal to them because they were adding resources to it, but oftentimes they're hiding people in places that they believe they can do no damage. So this is, again, why I rely on revenue as a sign of commitment as opposed to other things. Another pitfall that I've encountered, not understanding the full decision chain. In big companies, decisions get made very different than they do in startups. You can be dealing with someone that seems like a fairly senior level person. I was doing a deal with one of my former employers. I was dealing with a senior director of business development and a vice president of a hardware division who were bought into this particular deal that we had put together. I worked about 8 months on it. 3 days before we were supposed to hand over Golden Master code to them, Steve Jobs nixed the whole project. I had assumed, because I had a senior director of business development and a VP of a hardware division involved, that I was at the top, or I failed to ask the question, who else needs to sign off on this? Who else needs to agree to it? When's that decision going to get done? I probably never could have gotten to Steve Jobs myself, but you want to develop as high a level of relationships within a company as you can. And where you don't have those relationships, at least find proxies for those relationships. So I should have asked the VP of the hardware division, does Steve eventually have to sign off on this? And he would have told me yes. And then I would have pushed to get that sign off earlier than 3 days before we were supposed to hand over GM code. All right. And then the last, I see this from time to time in companies, and WebCentric was guilty of it, is trying to pursue two business models at once. I was with a company about a week ago that was sitting down and had rolled out their product, and they were now starting a white labeled version of their product. And this is really difficult to do, although it seems very attractive for somebody when some big company comes to you and says they'd like to white label your product. But I can tell you that the paths for product development couldn't be more divergent. And although it seems attractive to go down that path, if you haven't built your product from scratch to be white labeled, you probably have made some architectural decisions that are going to make it very difficult and very painful for you to go down that path. So I encourage companies to think this through from the start. If you think that's a business that you want to be in, architect your solution and build it from the start where your brand is one of the white labeled versions of your product. So you have the proper APIs in place, you have the proper structure in place for reskinning things. Don't try and go down that path a year after you've launched, because it will suck up resources and cause you a great deal of pain. Good? Yep.
And do you feel like that puts you in danger for becoming a professional services organization for your big clients that starts driving the decisions rather than your product roadmap?
Yeah. That's kind of what I was trying to allude to, because now you're trying to do things with your core product, like open up APIs when it may not have been built that way. Set it up so that it can interact with somebody else's billing system. Set it up so it can interact with somebody else's authentication system. I think personally it's smart to build that way from the get-go. And if you do, architect the way that we architect, which is with microservices and primitives, that gives you the most flexibility. But it also is not something that every startup is able to do. It's tough to find engineering talent that can think that way and can build that way from the start. And a lot of times, you've got to get something, an MVP, done and out the door in order to get funding. And so you'll make trade-offs. And you have to do that with the notion that, yeah, we'll go back and refactor that later. So, a question in the back.
Yeah. You have rightly emphasized the role of revenue to show the commitment. Does the nature of agreement matter? I mean, whether it's OEM deal, reseller, co-sale, joint marketing, as long as revenue is committed?
So I would look for revenue in every one of those except for the last example of joint marketing, because there really is no revenue transaction there. But I would still look for tangible commitments for marketing activities that they will do and will commit to do, and maybe a dollar value of the marketing that they're willing to do if online advertising is some part of it. But hard commitments there. But on all the other I absolutely look for revenue.
You're okay with pursuing both the branded its own and the white label?
Yeah, so the question is if you start up front and architect properly, can you do both businesses? And the answer is yes. And what I'd encourage you to think about is your brand is the first company that's going to white label your product, right? So you've got a development team that's building a white label product, and you've got a development team that's going to use that to build your first version of it. If you start out there, you actually will architect a much better system, and then you can open it up and make it extensible. I'm talking about the situation where, you're a year into it, and some big brand comes to you and wants to white label it, and it looks very attractive, but it's incredibly disruptive.
And also the startup, even though thinking about the white label business, cannot afford the microservices. So basically later, they're probably still a redoing of the guts. That's still okay, right?
In theory, yes, but my experience has been everybody tells themselves that, we'll eventually go back and refactor this, and nobody ever does it. Because there are always more features that you want to add, there are always new things that need to be done, and the technical debt that you accumulate rarely ever gets paid off. The only place that I actually see that happening has been, oddly enough, the shift to the cloud, where companies have to refactor their applications to get the efficiencies out of running in the cloud versus on premises, and so they'll bite the bullet and they'll do it then. But I've been inside telcos where they're still running billing systems on COBOL based. I mean, COBOL. Because nobody wants to touch them and nobody wants to change them, and there are always 10 more features that they'd rather have their engineers develop. And that makes sense. So make smart decisions when you architect early on. And don't kid yourself into thinking that you'll go back and refactor it later, because the likelihood of that is really low. Okay. So we'll switch and flip this. I always like to talk about kind of the disasters I've been in, because they're more fun than the successes. But we'll flip that sort of script and talk about what are some good habits that you can get into. And they're kind of somewhat the corollaries of those other ones. And this goes back to my earlier slide. Make sure your fundamentals are solid before you even think about talking to anyone. I started my career with this sort of mindset that, you know what, I'll talk to anyone. Like, maybe I'll learn something, maybe I'll uncover some interesting opportunities, but, you know, I have gone completely the opposite way, where I limit the people I will talk to. 98% of it's noise, 2% of it's signal. And if you can figure out how to get the signal to noise, that's great. But outside influences when you're a startup are typically negatives, not positives. So make sure your fundamentals are down. You know who you are. Everybody in your company knows who you are. You're well aligned, and you're somewhat successful. Then you can start thinking about engaging in these conversations. Make sure your product and your BD teams are well aligned. I talked a little bit about the web-centric example in Deutsche Telekom and how that created friction. We had the exact opposite when I was at CloudOn. Our VP and product and I were super well aligned. In fact, very often we had to gang up on our CEO and talk him out of certain things that he wanted to try and push us to do. And invariably, they were always business deals that he wanted me to go and execute on that were going to take us away from our core business of building our product. And we had to defend very vigorously in shouting matches. But I was so well aligned with our VP of product that, you know, we could finish each other's sentences. And there was no chance that I was going to be set off on a mission that was going to disrupt his plans. Or worse, I'm going to go sign a deal that he can't deliver on, which I've had happen to me before in other startups. So make sure there's alignment there, and that starts in the interviewing process. You want to, if you're going to bring on a BD person to go pursue partnerships, you want to make sure that you're philosophically aligned on what you're going to do, and that your product people, your head of your product team is going to support those efforts and believes in them, because that's a point of friction in so many startups that I've worked with. Okay. Ask for revenue, ask for revenue, ask for revenue, right? And if it's not up front, make sure there are solid commitments there. Because, again, you know somebody's committed when they're willing to write you a check. Back to my Apple story. Develop as deep-level executive relationships as you can. So while I was working on doing my deal with Netscape, my CEO was sitting down for dinner with Jim Barksdale. Like, I knew I had air cover. I knew that we were aligned. I knew there were opportunities there. I didn't assume that the people I was working with were managing up effectively. That's also another way in which you can get, you know, some level of commitment. If you've got a key level champion in the executive team, chances are that things are going to get done for you, and much less likely that things are going to slip, right? And you don't want to overuse that relationship, but you want to have it there if you ever need it. And you want that person being the key champion inside the company to see that this, whatever your relationship partnership is, gets done. Absolutely critical. And then the last, pursue one business model until you're successful. Don't try and do 8 things hoping 3 of them work out. Do one thing, do it really, really well. If you can't make money on it, pivot. But the sort of spread some seeds and see what grows approach, unless you've got a lot of capital that you're able to deploy, it doesn't work in the startup area. You got to find one thing, focus, do it really well, grow. Yes?
Seems a lot of what you're talking about, Steve Blank and the Lean Launchpad approach with the business canvas model, and don't build product until you've actually found customers that write you the check. Do you find that a good lens or approach for, if you see a startup using that approach, does that help fast track into your understanding what they want to do?
So I think, so the question was, is do you not build product until you've got paying or potential of paying customers? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so that approach of making sure people are using your technology before you invest more resources into it is it works in some businesses. It's very difficult for that to make in what I'd call big bet revolutionary businesses, because a lot of the things that need to be built out of vision as opposed to iteration. And what you're talking about is find some people that are using something, iterate it on it, and build. No? Oh, that's okay. So don't hire business development. Absolutely. That's kind of my earlier point. Wait. Make sure your business is fundamentally sound. You understand your business model. You have customers. Now, sometimes in an enterprise business, getting customers is hard, and you need somebody to come in and do that. That can very often be a business development person. But I'm talking specifically about going off and working with third parties to try and develop partnerships and strategic relationships. That's one where I would wait as long as possible. And only do so when you're going to get revenue out of it, because it's a huge distraction. And people talk themselves into like big opportunity with Deutsche Telekom. It could make the company. It damn near destroyed the company too. So you've got to make sure that fundamentals are down before you go do that. So I would agree 100%. I think the best business development people are really business savvy founders. And they turn on that business development gene when it's time. And they know that their first job is to be founder and drive the company before they go out and do some of those other things. So that, in terms of prepared content, is all I have. Happy to take some more questions and talk about some situations if anyone's interested. Yeah, please.
Here you go, ma'am. Thank you. To create strategic relationships, what's best practice for protecting your product?
You mean protecting it like IP or?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so certainly the first step, if you have defensible IP, you want to file patents as early as you can. It's sometimes painful to do that. It can be expensive, anywhere from $35,000 to $50,000 to get a patent all the way through the process. But that's your first and best defense, is that. There have been a lot of complaints about big companies fishing around for ideas in the startup community, and there's some companies that have reputations of, don't go talk to those guys. They're just interested in stealing your ideas. If you have venture funding, they will very often warn you who those people are. A couple of times I had partners pull me aside and be careful what you say to this company because they've got a bad reputation. But the only real thing you have is, be careful what you disclose, certainly about your future product roadmap, but also make sure that you file patents as early as you possibly can.
We're in a context of having too many different projects, B2B, B2C, we're a mess. The problem is that if we focus in one, the others will, and the others need attention as well, because otherwise we won't survive. So what is your advice, what you just said, into focusing on one, focusing on racing for that project that we want to get, versus trying to make all the other projects grow, but with less focus.
Yeah, it's focus, focus, focus. I had a company that was in the office the other day that just met. I wouldn't say I was advising them, but they had this really interesting photo sharing application that they developed. It was very compelling, and they had an iOS client, they had an Android client, they had a Windows Phone client, they had a desktop Windows client, they had a Mac client. They had like 7 different clients. And my advice to them was cut 6 of them. My advice would be keep the iOS client, make that thing super successful, and then go raise money off of that to go build the other client bases that you need. So focus on one market, one problem, do it really well, and then iterate. Because you can raise money on a super successful iOS application. You can't raise money on 7 semi-mediocre, focus, one. Because that's what a VC or an angel investor is going to look for, is have you shown traction and success that then can be expanded into other markets?
But that contradicts your previous comment that you architect your system so that you can expand and like white label.
I said, if you want to go into the white label business, and personally I think it's a crappy business and I would never fund a company that was in it, you have to do it from the start. You can't do it a year in. So if it sounded like I was advocating for white label business, no, I think they're crappy businesses.
Who was the first customer for AWS?
Yeah. Yeah. I really don't think white label businesses are a right way to go. You wind up serving way too many masters. You wind up getting marginalized in the value chain because whoever white labels is eventually going to squeeze as much of the margin out of the product as it possibly can, and you wind up being a utility. So if I sounded like I liked white label business, absolutely not. My point is don't try and do that a year into your business because AT&T's come along and said that they want to resell your product. They don't want to resell your product. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have a question related to what you said earlier about the commitment and the revenues. Do you have more kind of practical things to, first, to show that you can commit and also to make them commit? I mean, apart from writing the check, but before you get to the writing the check, there's a series of steps to get there. And so, I don't know, really practical things like, do you want to set up the meetings ahead of time, or talk to whatever, or things you could say to make this clearer?
I think, so the question was, is there a process that leads up to this writing of the check that I keep emphasizing? And the answer is yes, right? You talk about it up front. We're eventually going to want to see some revenue out of it. And then you sit down and put together a plan that includes milestones that you need to deliver on to get to the point where your product is ready for whatever type of relationship you envision. Now, the best is I just hand you my product, right? But very often there are some things that you need to do. So you want to have a schedule where there's some tangible milestones, and you've hit 3 or 4 milestones before that 5th milestone is they write you a check, right? And then you've proven it and you've shown goodwill and you've made progress. Now, the important thing is that, you need to hit those milestones once you've set them. And they can be anything from, early design deliveries to beta versions of the code to, usually if I'm handing over, and this is the old software model, if I'm handing over Golden Master code, that check goes in one direction, code goes in the other, right? Go ahead.
It's not purely a BD question, but there's a lot of companies, like AWS, Google, and others, VMware, that have their own venture groups. Do you have any advice on approaching them in the context of partnership?
So in terms of raising money?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
The way I look at it is, they're not going to be interested unless you're doing something that also complements them. So it's a combination BD plus fundraising type thing.
Yeah. So we have like the Alexa fund, that you can raise money for. But and typically, and I know the head of Microsoft Ventures very well, and what he'll say is they invest in companies that they believe they can help beyond just the venture investment, right? We have our Alexa fund that does the same thing, and so we're looking for areas where not only are we providing money, but we're providing a whole bunch more value that will give that startup a greater opportunity to succeed. So to the extent that you see things, now Google Ventures doesn't operate on that model. They operate more like a pure venture firm. They're not looking for something that then can be leveraged by the main Google side. In fact, a lot of the businesses that they fund have nothing to do with the corporate side. Intel Capital is very much the same way. They operate as a pure venture firm, whereas they used to only operate in areas where the Intel assets could add some value. So in that sense, if you think there's a tie there, absolutely have conversations with them, but be careful about what you commit to in return for the money. One thing you don't want to do is do anything that's going to send you down a path that's going to make it harder to raise money later. Yep.
Yeah, so I noticed that a lot of the advice also applies to pilots, especially big enterprise companies. Cool. So I noticed a lot of the advice you gave kind of applies to pilots as well, just because it's the same idea. You want them to commit early, you want to put money down, etc. In terms of, but you can do pilots earlier. I guess, do you have any extra advice that applies to pilots as opposed to kind of more formal partnerships?
Sure. So I am a big fan of funded pilots. I'm not afraid to ask for money up front to put resources into something. Again, if the company isn't willing, years ago, back when software used to come out on CDs, we used to hand these CDs out at trade shows all the time. And we'd spent like $200,000 on CDs or something. And I wanted to charge people for them $1. So it's a trial version of my software, you're going to pay $1. And my logic was that if you weren't willing to give me $1 for the trial, you certainly weren't going to give me $700 for my software when it came time to buy it. And everybody was aghast. It was like, oh my gosh, we can't do this. And eventually we started doing it. And we went from spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on CDs to spending single-digit thousands of dollars. But our conversion rate went from a fraction of a percent to around 20%. So for me, if you're not willing to give me $1 for the trial, you're not going to give me $700 for the product. No, you have to have budget you have to have budget yourself to fund that project. If you can get somebody to fund half of it, that's a good partnership model. We think it's going to cost us $25,000 to do this in engineering talent. We'll do the pilot for 12.5. We'll fund the other 12.5. And that sets a good kind of, here we are on even footing. We're partners. It's not me doing work for you because you think it'd be neat to see it get done. Okay?
Business development partnerships in consumer-related products as opposed to enterprise products, enterprise software products?
Let's see. I don't know that, I have my personal experience on that. I across both consumer-oriented and enterprise-oriented software products, and they're equally applicable. So at Smule, which is a music application, I did a deal with Glee, the television property, Fox Television, to basically create a co-branded version of the application with all the Glee music in it and everything like that. That absolutely drove the bulk of our customers because we were able to tap it and leverage, and they did television promotion for us, and Glee turned into this whole big deal. So that's pure consumer application where I leveraged their brand, and they created a closer relationship with their customers through our application. So you're looking to acquire customers and/or business. It doesn't really matter whether it's consumer or enterprise. I don't think so.
Hi, can you speak a little about the pricing, especially when it's in a competitive landscape? Like how to price your product? But at the same time, what pricing forces and aspects that come into play when you're negotiating with an enterprise?
Yeah, I'm not a pricing guy. That's just not an area of expertise of mine. I find it dreadfully boring. There are people that love that stuff, and they're pricing experts, and I sat next to a guy at Apple who was like pricing. So I'm the wrong, it's a smart question, I'm the wrong guy to ask. Sorry. I think we got time for one more, two more. Go back to that.
My question is related to what you said earlier in the earlier talk with, I think, Dave, when you talked about, don't really start thinking about raising money until you have 10 million users if you have a consumer app. Would you recommend, before it's a long road to get there, and you need a lot of resources to get there, would you recommend a freemium product or a freemium model to try to get there? Or
let me qualify that. I had said earlier that it used to be if you had 1 million users, you could go raise money, and then 1 million is now 10 million. That's very specific to the mobile application market, where I spent a bunch of my time, and it's specific to raising follow-on funding, Series A funding. You don't need that kind of traction in order to get seed funding. You need some kind of traction, and in general, the more you have, the better valuation you're going to get. But when you're looking at seed funding, you're really looking at growth trajectory. And if you can do that organically through a freemium model, that's the absolute best way to do it. Because that's true organic growth that will continue. And if you start throwing money at it, will just take off. The thing that I see companies do, especially in the mobile market, that is absolutely a complete waste of money is paid placement. Unless you've monetized and unless you know the lifetime value of your customer, paying for anything is usually not a good idea. Because if you've grown to 1 million users and you've done it through paid, any venture person worth their weight will completely discount that, because you've basically acquired customers by giving away money. So I'd go with freemium organic growth. And then once you've figured out the lifetime value of the customer, you can determine how much you're willing to pay to start acquiring those customers. I'm following the box.
How do you differentiate the way we would approach a corporate venture capital person versus just a regular VC? Any difference?
Yep. So how you approach venture capital versus corporate venture capital. There is a point in time when corporate venture makes some sense. It tends to be later stage. I wouldn't entertain doing anything with a corporate before a D round. It's just the problem is the moment you take money from corporate venture, it starts to narrow your opportunities, and it potentially locks you out of doing other interesting relationships with competitors of that corporate venture. So I always try to avoid taking any corporate money. You may do it later on down the line, and if you do and you can swing it, I'd pick the 2 or 3 top people in your area, and try and get venture money from all of them, as opposed to taking it from one and then locking yourself out of being able to deal with the other 2. Okay, last question.
What is your opinion on approaching biggies like Google and Amazon for a partnership when your patent for a solution with their products is still pending?
I missed the middle part of that.
The patent is still pending, but you have a wonderful...
Patent's pending? Yeah, as long as it's filed, you're fine. I would still be careful about how much you share. And anybody that you talk to, certainly at Amazon, and I would assume other large companies, they understand that. And you just have to know. Like when I went in for my first meetings with Google, I got into the lobby and they wanted me to sign an NDA. And I said, we're not going to share anything that's under NDA. I wouldn't do that, right? And they wouldn't let me in the building, so I called the guy and we had to meet in the lobby, right? So as a general rule, I wouldn't sign an NDA, wouldn't release anything to a large company that you considered confidential. Just not worth the risk. All right? Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.